Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. I'm finishing up the body of my Cereus sweater, and today I'll show you how to do the alternating suspended bind off. The suspended bind off is one of my go-to finishing methods because it has the structural stability of a plain bind off with a little bit of extra elasticity. It can be done completely knitwise or purlwise, or for binding off ribbing where you're alternating between knits and purls. Let's get started. As I'm binding off my ribbing, I'm going to continue working the stitches as they appear. So I'll knit the knits and purl the purls. The bind off begins just like a plain bind off. So you work your first 2 stitches. Before you pass that first stitch over the second stitch, you need to make sure your yarn is set up to work whatever your next stitch is. So my next stitch is a purl, so I need to have the yarn at the front, and that's where it is. Pass over the stitch, the first one over the second, but instead of dropping it off the left needle tip, it stays suspended here until you work the next stitch. And that's why you have to make sure that your yarn is set up before you pass over, because you can't bring it in between the needles without it getting caught on this suspended stitch. So I'll work my next stitch. Purls are a little bit tricky because you have to pull the yarn through the stitch and then back forward between that suspended stitch and the one you just purled. Drop the suspended stitch and the one you just worked off the needle. Before you pass over, make sure your yarn is set up. Mine is. Pass over and leave it suspended on the left needle. Work your stitch. Drop the suspended stitch and the one you just worked off the left needle. Set up for the next stitch, and mine's a knit, so my yarn needs to be at the back. Pass over, leaving the stitch suspended on the left needle. Work the next stitch. I'm set up for my knit. Pass over. My next stitch is a purl, so I'm going to bring my yarn forward before I pass over. Pass over the stitch and purl. So really you just need to make sure that before you pass over and leave this stitch suspended that you're setting up for the next stitch. And just continue on until you have bound off all of your stitches. When all of your stitches have been bound off and just one stitch remains on the right needle, you would trim your yarn. And I happen to have a nice yarn chicken wing here, so I don't need to trim it. It's already short enough. And then you can just pull that yarn tail through the final stitch and you're done binding off. When you're working the round like I am here, it's probably a good idea to minimize this jog somehow, because there's a little bit of a gap between that last bound off stitch and the first one. And to do that, what I like to do is thread my yarn tail onto a yarn needle. And then I look for my very first bound off stitch, the edge, and I'm going to take my yarn needle and go under both legs of that first stitch from the front to the back and pull the yarn through. And you can see there how that gap just closes up nicely. And then take your yarn needle down through that final bound off stitch, just one leg of it this time, and down through to the back. And again, that just kind of closes up that edge nicely so you don't have that big jog in between the beginning of the bind off and the end of the bind off. And then you can just weave in your yarn tail on the wrong side of your work. I hope you enjoyed learning how to do the alternating suspended bind off. If you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you'd like to try this technique in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechillydog.com and look for my Cereus sweater. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!